The air in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old money. It was a world unto itself, separate from the streets outside, a place where crystal glasses chimed a soft, constant rhythm against the backdrop of a quiet jazz trio. Chandeliers, like constellations of frozen light, hung from a ceiling so high it seemed lost in a soft haze. Every surface gleamed, from the polished marble floors to the silverware laid out on endless tables. This was a kingdom built on wealth, and the man holding court in the center of it all was its undisputed king. He was a titan of industry, a billionaire whose name was synonymous with success and power. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. A practiced smile was fixed on his face, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, were constantly assessing, evaluating. He was bored. These events, while necessary for his public image, were predictable. The same faces, the same polite conversation, the same subtle jockeying for favor. He was looking for something, anything, to break the monotony. His gaze eventually settled on the centerpiece of the evening's charity auction. A magnificent grand piano that sat on a raised platform, bathed in its own special spotlight. It was a 1920s Steinway, restored to a breathtaking luster. Its black lacquer finish mirrored the chandeliers and the smiling faces of the guests, creating a perfect, shimmering reflection of this opulent world. The curves of its body were elegant and powerful, a promise of the music it once made and could make again. To the billionaire, it was more than just a musical instrument. It was an asset, a piece of history, a trophy. He could already picture it in the sprawling living room of his penthouse apartment, a conversation piece that spoke of his taste and his ability to acquire the very best. He admired its lines, its sheer presence, and for a moment, he felt a genuine flicker of desire, a rare feeling in a life where almost everything was already his. That's when the perfect, humming atmosphere of the room began to fray at the edges. A slight disturbance near the grand entrance, like a stone dropped into a still pond. A waiter, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, stumbled slightly, his eyes wide with surprise. Heads began to turn, a ripple of murmurs spreading through the clusters of guests. The smooth jazz music seemed to falter for a beat. The source of the disruption was a small figure that had somehow slipped past the security guards, who stood like statues at the doors. He was a smudge of dirt and color against the pristine white and gold of the room, a complete anomaly that the eyes of the wealthy struggled to process. He was a boy, couldn't have been more than 12, with a thin frame and clothes that were little more than rags. His hair was matted, and his face was smudged with the grime of the streets, but the boy seemed utterly oblivious to the attention he was drawing. He didn't look at the shocked faces or the fancy clothes. His eyes, wide and intensely focused, were locked on one thing and one thing only, the piano. He moved with a strange purpose, his small, worn shoes making no sound on the thick carpet as he navigated through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were a force of nature. He walked past tables laden with food he had likely never seen, past men and women wearing jewelry worth more than his entire world had ever been. None of it registered. For him, the room, the people, the light, it all faded into a blur, leaving only the shining black form of the Steinway in sharp, perfect focus. It was as if he were walking towards a long-lost home. A security guard, a large man whose suit strained at the seams, finally shook off his surprise and moved swiftly to intercept the young intruder. He reached out a meaty hand, his face a mask of professional annoyance, ready to grab the boy by the collar and escort him out with the minimum amount of fuss. The crowd watched, a collective intake of breath, anticipating the quick, embarrassing end to this strange interruption. But just as the guard's fingers were about to close on the boy's shoulder, the boy did something that stopped everyone cold. He darted the last few feet to the platform and, with a reverence that was almost sacred, placed a small, dirty hand flat against the polished surface of the piano. It was a gesture of possession, of connection. The contrast was startling. The grime of his hand against the flawless, mirror-like black of the lacquer. The guard froze, his hand hovering in the air. The boy didn't look at him. He didn't look at anyone. He lifted his head, and his eyes found the most powerful man in the room, The billionaire who had been admiring the piano just moments before. The boy's chest rose and fell with a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice, though thin and reedy, cut through the stunned silence with surprising clarity and strength. He didn't shout. He simply stated a fact as he saw it. "Sir, I own this piano." The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. For a full second, there was absolute silence. The jazz trio had stopped playing. The murmuring had died. Everyone looked from the boy to the billionaire, waiting to see how this impossible drama would unfold. Then a sound broke the silence. It started as a chuckle from one of the guests, a nervous, disbelieving sound. It was quickly picked up by another, and then another, until a wave of laughter began to roll through the room. It was the laughter of people who were comfortable, who were secure in their world, and who found this boy's claim to be the most ridiculous, and therefore most entertaining thing they had ever heard. And at the center of it all was the billionaire. His initial shock had melted away, replaced by a profound sense of amusement. He threw his head back and let out a booming, hearty laugh that filled the entire ballroom. It was the laugh of a man who found the universe to be a wonderfully absurd place, and this little street urchin, with his impossible claim, was the most delightful absurdity he had encountered in years. He wasn't laughing at the boy, not cruelly. He was laughing at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of it all. Waving a dismissive hand at the frozen guard, a wide, genuine smile finally replacing his practiced one, he decided to play along. This was far more interesting than polite conversation. The billionaire's booming laugh echoed through the now silent ballroom, finally fading into a chuckle that still held a note of disbelief. He looked down at the small, defiant figure, a smudge of reality on his perfectly polished evening. The boy's statement, "I own this piano," was so preposterous, so utterly out of place, that it had shattered the boring predictability of the event. For the first time all night, the billionaire felt a spark of genuine interest. This was better than any auction, any dull conversation about stocks and mergers. This was a real, live drama playing out right in front of him. He saw an opportunity, not just for amusement, but to reinforce his own position in this world of make-believe. He would play along, and in doing so, he would give everyone a lesson in reality, with a fluid motion that spoke of years of practiced confidence. The billionaire crouched down. He brought himself to the boy's level, a gesture that looked like humility but was, in fact, the ultimate form of condescension. He was entering the boy's world, but on his own terms. A wide, predatory smile was plastered across his face. "You own this piano?" He repeated, his voice a low, amused rumble that was meant for the boy but loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "That's a very brave thing to say. A very bold claim." He looked the boy up and down, taking in the frayed clothes, the dirt under his fingernails, the tangled hair. The contrast was delicious. I like brave people. I like bold people. So I'm going to make you a deal. A real business deal." The crowd leaned in, their earlier laughter replaced by a curious, hushed anticipation. This was turning into a show. The security guard stood by, looking uncertain, his orders now unclear. The billionaire continued, his eyes locked on the boy's. "You prove to me, right here, right now, that this piano belongs to you. If you can do that, I won't just buy it for you. I'll buy it for you. And I'll write you a check for $100,000. Cash. You can do whatever you want with it." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. The amount was astronomical, a life-changing sum. It was an insane, impossible offer. But then the billionaire's smile sharpened, turning cold. "But," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "if you can't prove it." "And I mean you have to prove it to me. Then you will work for me. You'll work off the value of this little interruption. For 1 year, you will be cleaning the toilets in my office tower. Every single one of them. Do we have a deal?" The boy flinched. The image of cleaning toilets was a harsh, ugly thing, a slap in the face to the beautiful memory he held of the piano. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, 100 heavy, judging stares. He could feel their pity and their scorn. He was just a street kid, a nobody. What could he possibly offer as proof against a man who owned buildings, who could buy and sell lives with a flick of his pen? Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. But then he looked past the billionaire at the piano. He saw the way the light hit its curved side, the way the black finish seemed to hold a universe of stars within it. He remembered his mother's hands, dancing on the keys. And in that moment, the fear was replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. This wasn't about the money. It wasn't about winning a bet. It was about honoring a memory. It was about claiming the last piece of his mother he had left in the world. He took a deep breath, looked the billionaire straight in the eye, and gave a single, firm nod. "Good," the billionaire said, standing up and brushing off his trousers with a theatrical flourish. "The floor is yours. Impress me." The boy didn't speak. He didn't have a document or a photograph. His proof was not something you could hold in your hand. It was something etched into his memory. He closed his eyes, shutting out the glaring lights of the ballroom, the silent, watching crowd, and the intimidating figure of the billionaire. He let the noises of the room fade away until all he could hear was the faint, rhythmic beating of his own heart. And then he was no longer in a hotel ballroom. He was back in their small apartment, a place that always smelled like sunshine, wood polish, and his mother's lavender perfume. The piano wasn't on a stage under a spotlight. It was tucked against the wall of their living room. Its top covered in a spread of sheet music and a half-finished cup of tea. He saw his mother, her face illuminated by the afternoon sun streaming through the window. She was smiling at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Come here, my little virtuoso," she would say, patting the space on the bench beside her. He would scramble up, his small legs dangling above the floor. He remembered the feel of the smooth, cool wood of the bench against his skin. He remembered watching her fingers, long and graceful, as they coaxed beautiful, complex melodies from the keys. She was teaching him a simple song, a lullaby. His small fingers fumbled, pressing the wrong notes. "It's okay," she would whisper, her voice warm and encouraging. "Even the greatest pianists make mistakes. The music isn't about being perfect. It's about feeling." He remembered one afternoon he was playing with his favorite toy car, a little red fire truck. He was making it drive all over the piano, imagining it was a grand mountain range. In his excitement, he scraped the underside of the bench. He had been horrified, a tear welling up in his eye, but his mother had just laughed. She knelt down and pointed to the tiny, almost invisible mark. "There," she had said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "That's your mark. Now a little piece of you is a part of this piano too. It's our secret." And he remembered the C-sharp key, the one right in the middle of the keyboard. It always stuck, just a little. You had to press it a bit harder to get it to sound. It was a quirk, an imperfection that made their piano unique. It became a game between them. "Don't forget the sticky key," she would call out as he practiced. His most precious memory, though, was a secret just for him. One day, for his birthday, she had told him to close his eyes. She led him to the piano and lifted the lid. "Open them," she said softly. Inside, carved into the dark wood with the delicate point of a nail file, were a few simple words. "For my Leo," it read, "may your music always fly." He had traced the letters with his fingertip, feeling the rough edges of the carving, his heart swelling with a love so big it felt like it might burst right out of his chest. That was his piano. Not the wood, not the keys, but the memories, the secrets, the love that lived inside it. A voice, sharp and impatient, cut through his reverie. "Well, we're all waiting." It was the billionaire. The boy's eyes snapped open. The warm, sunlit apartment was gone. He was back in the cold, glittering ballroom. The faces were staring at him, some bored, some amused. But he was no longer afraid. He carried the warmth of his memories with him like a shield. He looked at the billionaire, his gaze clear and steady. He was ready to show them his proof. The boy's eyes snapped open, the warm, sunlit memory of his mother fading like a dream upon waking. He was back in the cold, glittering ballroom, the weight of 100 stairs pressing down on him. The billionaire stood over him, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of impatience and smug amusement. The crowd, which had been briefly captivated by the boy's stillness, was beginning to grow restless again. A few whispers slithered through the air, and someone let out a small, dismissive snort. The moment of strange magic was broken, and the absurdity of the situation was reasserting itself. A homeless boy claiming to own a priceless piano. It was a joke, and the punchline was coming. "Well?" the billionaire said, his voice sharp and cutting through the whispers. "We're all waiting. You've had your moment of quiet contemplation. Now, where is your proof? Do you have a secret receipt tucked away in your pocket? Perhaps a deed written on a napkin?" A few titters of laughter echoed his sarcasm. The boy, however, didn't flinch. He looked past the billionaire's expensive leather shoes, past the polished floor, and his gaze settled on the piano bench. He took a step towards it, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a sleeping animal. "The bench," the boy said, his voice quiet but clear. "Please look underneath the front edge of the bench. On the right side." The billionaire raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face despite himself. This was an odd, specific request. Not the vague claim of a child, but the precise instruction of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. With a sigh that was more for his audience than for the boy, the billionaire played along. He gave a slight, theatrical shrug as if to say, "Why not?" And then, with a grunt of effort that betrayed his expensive suit, he knelt down on one knee. The position was undignified for a man of his stature, and the crowd watched with renewed interest. He peered under the bench, his eyes scanning the dark, polished wood. At first, he saw nothing. It was pristine, just like the rest of the instrument. The restorers had done a magnificent job. He was about to stand up and dismiss the boy entirely when he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible white line. It wasn't a crack in the lacquer, but a scratch underneath the lacquer, a flaw that had been sealed over. It was no bigger than his thumbnail, a tiny, jagged little mark that was completely out of place on the otherwise perfect surface. He reached out and touched it with his fingertip, feeling the faint indentation. It was so small, so utterly insignificant, that it was a miracle it had even been noticed, let alone preserved. The practiced, condescending smile on his face faltered just for a second. A tiny crack had appeared in his armor of certainty. He stood up, brushing off his knee, his expression unreadable. "A scratch?" he said, his voice a little less booming than before. "A minor imperfection. It proves nothing." But even as he said the words, they lacked conviction. The boy didn't argue. He simply moved on to his next piece of evidence, his calm confidence a stark contrast to the billionaire's growing unease. "The key," the boy said, pointing a slender finger towards the keyboard. "The C-sharp key, right in the middle." "It sticks," the billionaire let out a short, harsh laugh. "Sticks? This is a masterfully restored instrument." "It doesn't stick." But the boy just held his gaze. "Please," he said softly. "Try it." There was something in the boy's eyes, a quiet certainty, that compelled the billionaire to act. He wanted to prove the boy wrong, to shatter this ridiculous fantasy once and for all. He reached out a manicured finger and pressed the C-sharp key. For a moment, nothing happened. The key resisted his pressure, refusing to budge. The billionaire pressed harder, a frown creasing his forehead. Then, with a soft click, the key gave way and a clear, perfect note rang out in the silent room. He tried it again. The same thing. A slight hesitation, a moment of resistance, and then the sound. It was a tiny, almost unnoticeable flaw, a quirk in an otherwise perfect machine. But it was there. The boy was right. The last vestiges of the billionaire's smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. The murmuring in the crowd had died completely. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that presses down on your shoulders, thick with unasked questions and dawning realizations. People were no longer watching a street kid. They were watching a mystery unfold. The boy knew he had them. He could feel the shift in the room's energy. He took a deep breath and walked to the side of the piano, placing his hand on the prop stick that held the lid open. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The last piece. He looked at the billionaire, his eyes pleading. Could you please open the lid all the way? The auctioneer, who had been standing by looking horrified, stepped forward. Sir, I don't think that's advisable. The mechanism is delicate. Do it, the billionaire commanded, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier charm. He was no longer playing a game. This was no longer entertainment. He needed to know. The auctioneer hesitated for a second, then nodded and moved to the piano. With a gentle hand, he carefully lifted the prop stick and let the heavy lid fall back, revealing the inner workings of the instrument, the cast iron plate, the copper strings, the hammers, and the dark, unfinished wood of the inner rim. The boy leaned in, his eyes scanning the wood until they found what they were looking for. He pointed to a spot on the inner rim, just to the right of the strings. The billionaire and the auctioneer both leaned in. The crowd craned their necks, trying to see. At first they saw nothing but wood. But then, as the light from the ballroom caught it at just the right angle, they saw it. Faint, almost worn away by time, but unmistakably there, were a few words carved into the wood. The handwriting was delicate and feminine. It wasn't the work of a professional engraver, but an act of love. The billionaire squinted, reading the inscription aloud in a hoarse, disbelieving whisper. For my Leo, he read, may your music always fly. The words hung in the air, a final, undeniable testament. A punch to the gut? It wasn't a mark of ownership in a legal sense, but a claim far more powerful. It was a mother's blessing, a sacred promise etched into the soul of the instrument. The billionaire stared at the carving, his mind reeling. He thought of the contracts, the deeds, the legal documents that defined his world. They were cold, impersonal, and could be bought and sold. But this was something else entirely. This was a memory made real. This was love made solid. He slowly straightened up, his eyes moving from the carving inside the piano to the small, determined boy standing beside it. The boy, Leo, the name from the inscription. The laughter was gone from the billionaire's eyes, replaced by a profound and soul-shaking shock. He finally understood. This wasn't a game. This was never a game. This was a boy's life, and he had just publicly tried to humiliate him for it. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer a pause. It was a verdict. The words carved inside the piano, for my Leo, may your music always fly, hung in the air like a sacred text, and everyone present was a witness. The billionaire, a man who commanded boardrooms and manipulated markets with a few carefully chosen words, was utterly speechless. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a hollowing out in his chest. His entire life was built on things that could be quantified, on assets and liabilities, on contracts and signatures. But this boy's proof was something else entirely. It was a memory carved into wood, a love made permanent. It was a truth more powerful and more real than any document he had ever signed. He slowly straightened up, his joints feeling stiff as if he had aged a decade in the last few minutes. His eyes moved from the faint carving to the boy's face, and for the first time he didn't see a homeless urchin or a bold challenger. He just saw a boy who was standing on the precipice of losing the last tangible piece of his mother, and had risked everything to get it back. The billionaire's carefully constructed world of irony and amusement had crumbled, leaving behind something raw and uncomfortable. He felt a wave of heat wash over his face, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a young man. Shame. He had made a spectacle of this child's grief, turning it into a game for his own entertainment. He had wagered a year of toilet cleaning against a lifetime of love. The absurdity and cruelty of his own bet hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to see through facades. But he had been so blinded by his own wealth and arrogance that he had completely missed the one thing that truly mattered. The human story standing right in front of him. He turned away from the piano, his movements now stiff and deliberate. The performance was over. The crowd, which had been a source of validation for him, now felt like a jury. He ignored them. He walked back to the auctioneer's podium, his face a mask of grim resolve. The auctioneer, a man who had seen countless high-stakes bidding wars, looked utterly bewildered. "Sir," he began, but the billionaire held up a hand, silencing him. "The auction is over," the billionaire said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. It was a different kind of power than he had wielded earlier. It wasn't the power of wealth, but the power of conviction. "I am placing the final bid. I will pay double the highest offer placed so far." A collective gasp went through the room. It was an astronomical sum, a price that far exceeded the piano's market value. He wasn't buying an instrument. He was paying a debt. He pulled a checkbook from the inner pocket of his suit jacket and a gold pen from his breast pocket. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the only sound in the room. He wrote with a swift, decisive hand, not even bothering to look at the amount. He tore the check from the book and folded it. He walked back to the boy, who was standing perfectly still beside the piano, his hand resting lightly on its edge as if to anchor himself. The billionaire stopped in front of him, the check held between his fingers. He looked down at the boy, at the smudged face and the eyes that held a universe of pain and hope. He remembered his own cruel, mocking offer. "A deal is a deal," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of all its earlier condescension. He held out the check. $100,000. "It's yours." The boy looked at the piece of paper, then back up at the billionaire. He didn't reach for it. To him, it was just a piece of paper. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't buy back the afternoon spent at that piano with his mother. It couldn't bring back the sound of her laughter. And it couldn't solve the most immediate problem he faced, where he would sleep tonight or where he would go tomorrow. He had won the argument, he had proven his point, but he was still just a boy in a room full of strangers. With a priceless piano he had no home for and a check he couldn't cash. And in that moment the billionaire saw it all. He saw the absurdity of his solution. He was a problem solver by nature, a man who saw a challenge and threw money at it until it went away. But this wasn't a problem that could be solved with money. Giving the boy the piano and the check was like giving a drowning man a gold coin. It was a gesture, but it was a useless one. The boy would leave this room with a piece of paper and a memory, and he would be right back on the streets, vulnerable and alone. The victory would be hollow, the story tragic. The billionaire had built an empire on seeing the bigger picture, and now the bigger picture was painfully clear. He had a choice. He could walk away, his debt paid, his reputation as a man of his word intact. Or he could do something more. Something real. He slowly retracted the hand holding the check. He looked at the boy, then at the piano, and then back at the boy. The three of them were connected now, bound by this strange, transformative encounter. "That check is no good to you right now," the billionaire said, stating a simple fact. "And this piano, you can't take it with you. It needs a home. And so do you." He took a deep breath, the words feeling foreign and yet right on his tongue. "I'm going to make you another offer. Not a bet, an agreement." The boy watched him, his expression wary and uncertain. "I will buy this piano," the billionaire continued, his voice gaining a little of its old confidence. But this time it was a confidence built on purpose, not pride. "And I will hold that check for you, in a trust. But that's not the important part. The important part is this: I will provide you with a home. A real home, with a warm bed and food on the table. I will provide you with an education, the best schools in the country. And I will find you the best piano teachers in the world, so you can make your mother's wish come true, so your music can fly." He paused, letting the words sink in. He wasn't talking down to the boy. He was talking to him as an equal, laying out a business proposal for a life. "This isn't charity," he added, almost as if to convince himself. "This is an investment. I saw something in you tonight, a spirit I haven't seen in a long time. I'm investing in that. In you. All you have to do is say yes." The boy was stunned into silence. He looked from the billionaire's face to the piano and back again. It was too much. A home? A school? A future? It was a dream, a fairy tale, something that happened to other children, not to him. His first instinct was to run, to flee from this overwhelming kindness that felt as dangerous as any threat. But where would he go? Back to the cold, lonely streets? He looked into the billionaire's eyes and saw no mockery there, no pity. He saw the same shock he had seen before, but now it was mixed with something else. A sense of purpose, a quiet determination. This man, this titan of industry, had been changed by their encounter. And in that change, the boy saw a glimmer of hope, a fragile, terrifying, but undeniable path forward. He took a shaky breath and gave a single, hesitant nod. "Okay," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Okay." The word "okay" hung in the air between them, small and fragile, yet it held the weight of a new beginning. The billionaire gave a short, firm nod, as if closing a deal, but his eyes held a flicker of something much softer, something like relief. He turned to the auctioneer, who was standing by with a look of utter bewilderment, and gave him a series of quiet, efficient instructions. The piano would be crated and moved to a secure location. The check would be processed through his foundation's lawyers. The crowd, which had been a silent, watching entity, began to buzz again, but this time it was a different kind of energy. It wasn't the idle gossip of the bored elite. It was the hushed excitement of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. They watched as the billionaire placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, not to guide or control him, but in a gesture of quiet connection, and led him out of the ballroom, away from the shimmering lights and the stunned faces. The journey to the billionaire's penthouse was a silent one. The boy sat in the back of a car so clean it smelled of new leather, his small body sinking into the soft seats. He pressed his face against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white. It was a world he had only ever seen from the outside, from cold park benches and damp alleyways. Now he was in the heart of it, wrapped in warmth and safety, but he felt a strange mix of terror and wonder. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, even the pain and the hunger, and stepping into a life that felt like a dream. The man in the front seat didn't speak. He seemed to understand that the boy needed this quiet time to process, to let the reality of his decision settle in. He wasn't just taking a boy home. He was accepting a responsibility that was far heavier and more complex than any business deal he had ever made. The penthouse was not what the boy had expected. It wasn't cold or sterile like a museum. It was spacious and filled with light, but it felt lived in. There were books stacked on tables, a half-finished puzzle on a coffee table, and a large, slightly droopy plant in the corner. It felt like a home that was waiting for something to make it complete. The man showed the boy to a room. It was bigger than the boy's entire old apartment. The bed was covered in a thick, soft comforter, and the window looked out over the entire city. "This is your room," the man said, his voice a little awkward. You can do what you want with it. We can get you things. Whatever you need." The boy simply stood in the doorway, afraid to touch anything, afraid to soil this perfect, clean space with his presence. That first night, he didn't sleep on the big soft bed. He curled up on the plush rug beside it, the familiar hardness of the floor, a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become too soft, too strange. The days that followed were a slow, gentle process of unfolding. The first real bath was a revelation. The boy soaked in the hot, soapy water until his skin wrinkled, watching the grime of the streets swirl away and disappear down the drain. The first meal was not a fancy feast, but a simple bowl of hot soup and a sandwich, made by the man himself in his own kitchen. They ate in silence, the clinking of the spoon against the ceramic bowl the only sound. It was in these small, quiet moments that a bond began to form. The man, a titan of industry who was used to commanding rooms, was surprisingly clumsy and uncertain in this new role. He didn't know how to talk to a child, let alone a child who had been through so much. So he didn't try to be a father. He was just there. He made sure the boy was fed and clothed. He drove him to appointments with tutors and doctors. And he listened. A week after they moved in, the piano arrived. It was placed in a sun-drenched corner of the living room, its black lacquer gleaming. The boy approached it slowly, almost reverently. He hadn't played since his mother was gone. He was afraid that the music had died inside him. He sat on the bench, the same bench where he had carved his secret mark, and his fingers found the familiar keys. He pressed the sticky C-sharp, and it gave way with its familiar, gentle resistance. And then he began to play. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a simple, halting melody, the lullaby his mother had taught him. He made mistakes, his fingers rusty and unsure, but as he played, the music began to flow more freely, and with each note he felt a piece of his heart healing. The man stood in the doorway of the room, listening, a look of profound awe on his face. He had bought countless pieces of art, listened to world-renowned musicians in grand concert halls, but he had never heard anything as beautiful or as heartbreaking as the simple melody played by that boy on that piano. In that moment he understood. This wasn't an investment in a future star. This was a rescue mission for a lost soul. 5 years passed like the turning of a page. The boy, no longer a boy but a young man, had grown into his promise. The awkward, quiet child was now a confident, poised young man with a rare and prodigious talent. The penthouse, once so quiet, was now filled with music, from complex classical etudes to the simple, joyful melodies he composed himself. The bond between him and the billionaire had deepened into something that resembled a father-son relationship, built not on obligation, but on mutual respect and a shared love for the music that had brought them together. The man had found a new purpose, not in building his empire, but in nurturing the talent he had discovered. He had even started a foundation to help other children with artistic gifts. A far more fulfilling legacy than any skyscraper or corporate merger, the final scene took place in a grand concert hall, the inaugural performance for the new foundation. The hall was packed, but in a front-row box sat the billionaire, watching with a quiet, humble pride. On the stage, under a single spotlight, sat the same 1920 Steinway grand piano. The young man at the keyboard looked out at the audience, his eyes finding the man in the box. He gave a small, grateful nod, and then he began to play. The music that filled the hall was the same simple lullaby from all those years ago, but it was transformed. It was richer, more complex, and filled with a depth of emotion that spoke of a journey through darkness and into the light. It was a tribute to a mother's love, a testament to a boy's resilience, and a thank you to the man who had listened. And as the billionaire listened, he wasn't thinking about the return on his investment. He was thinking about the laugh that had echoed in that ballroom, a laugh that now seemed a lifetime ago. He wasn't the man who owned the piano. He was the man who had been given the gift of its music, and in doing so, had found his own.